People spend their Alaska cruise money backward all the time. They pay hundreds of dollars for a basic sightseeing tour in a port where the best attractions are sitting a few minutes from the ship. Then they save money on the cabin during the one cruise where the scenery outside the ship is part of what they came to see. Look, Alaska can be expensive, really expensive, but some of that spending is absolutely worth it. And some of it is just paying someone to drive you past places that you could have reached on your own. Hi, I'm Melissa, a university professor who loves to cruise and who loves to talk ship. I'm going to take you through a typical Alaska sailing, starting in Seattle and continuing through the major ports. And I'll tell you exactly where I choose to spend my money, where I save it, and the one cabin upgrade that I now prioritize whenever I go back. And before you assume I'm about to tell everyone to spend thousands of dollars, I am not, because some of my favorite Alaska days have cost me almost nothing. Before we get to a single port, you need to understand what you're walking into, because Alaska cruising has grown crazy dramatically over the past few years, while the ports themselves, of course, they can't really change that much. They've stayed pretty small. Ketchikan has only about 8,000 residents. Skagway has roughly 1,100. So you park 2 or 3 cruise ships beside a little town that size on the same morning, and the cruisers can sometimes outnumber the locals several times over. Juneau, the capital, has gotten so crowded that unfortunately it now limits how many cruise passengers it allows ashore on a given day. Now, that doesn't mean you should avoid these ports. It just means timing is everything. Get up and get off the ship early, which I know can be brutal with those time changes and those differences, but do that and get in your self-guided walking part before any big excursion groups come back or go out. And eat lunch a little before or after the rush. Then a town that feels packed at noon can feel like a completely different place at 8:30 in the morning. Weather is the next thing that people sometimes get wrong when it comes to Alaskan cruising. They always assume it's going to be this Arctic tundra, but Southeast Alaska in cruise season is usually cool, damp, and unpredictable, but it's usually not a deep freeze. Summer afternoons can sit in the low to middle 60s, rain can roll in even when the morning started out clear, and you do have to prepare for precipitation because again, a day can look great and clear and then some drizzle will roll in later. So it's really, really important when you take an Alaskan cruise to pack in layers, and one of those layers needs to include a legit waterproof shell. That's going to serve you far better than one big, giant, fluffy, heavy winter coat. My very first Alaskan cruise was in mid-September, and that tends to be the tail end of the season, so I braced myself for colder temperatures than I would encounter if I went in June or July. But I packed with me a hooded rainproof puffer coat, a pair of light gloves, and some lighter jackets to wear underneath, and that was more than sufficient for what I needed. And on my most recent visit, it was actually a record heat wave. I visited in June. Skagway climbed into the mid-80s, and I actually realized I needed to pack sunglasses and sunscreen. So that's the Alaskan packing rule. Prepare for basically several seasons in the same day. The daylight will really mess with you too. Around the start of summer, Juneau gets more than 18 hours of daylight, and the sky can look like the late afternoon when your body is begging for sleep. And there's also all types of time changes, especially if you're like me. You're in the Midwest or on the East Coast, and you're already adjusting to West Coast time differences because you sailed out of Seattle, for example, and there's time changes along the way back and forth. And here's something you absolutely want to make sure you have on your packing list that you might not think about. If you have a cabin room or an ocean view room because of this daylight issue, bring an eye mask. Because even with those curtains closed, there's always gaps around the edges. And for me, I like it dark when I sleep, so I struggle with that. So my eye mask came in clutch on my Alaskan cruises. Another thing to understand is the Seattle factor. Most round-trip Alaskan cruises leave out of Seattle, and the first mistake happens before you ever board. Seattle has not 1, but 2 cruise terminals, and unfortunately they do sit several miles apart. Pier 66 is right on the downtown waterfront. This is the, in my opinion, nicer pier because there's a lot of fun things to do, and it mostly serves Norwegian. Pier 91 is the larger one and handles most of the other major lines heading north. So make sure you show up at the right one so you have a good start to your cruise and you aren't left stressed and scrambling. So again, always confirm the terminal that your ship uses. It is usually going to be that bigger one, but just double check. Seattle also has one of the most useful disembarkation perks in the country, and it's free. It's called Port Valet, and this means at the end of your Alaskan cruise, you had a great time, but you also have a lot of bags because, again, those layers you got to pack means a lot of luggage. So when you get off the ship, you don't want to be dealing with these huge bags. But with Port Valet, I wish every cruise port in the world had this. So here's how it works. You do have to sign up for it. There's typically paperwork that they will ask you to fill out several days before disembarkation. So it's really important not to miss that because I did that on my most most recent Alaskan cruise, I got the paper, I kind of ignored it thinking I'll just do it later, and I actually missed the cutoff, so I couldn't take advantage of Port Valet. So don't be a dummy like me. But here's how it works. You pack your bags, you leave them outside your cabin on the last night, having done the paperwork and said, yes, I want to take advantage of Port Valet a few days before. And as usual, the cruise line will come get your bags, but instead of just taking them outside to the cruise terminal that you fetch on disembarkation day, they actually take them to the airport and check them for you with the airline. It's absolutely amazing. Now, there are a couple of catches. Not every cruise line participates in this. MSC is an exception. And you also have to have a certain flight, and you have to be flying on a certain airline. Your flight has to be leaving Seattle on the same day that you disembark the ship. And again, that eligibility can vary depending on cruise line and airline. So don't make assumptions that it's going to be available. It may or may not be. I do know Holland America Line participates with this. I did use that on my first Alaskan cruise. I luckily didn't miss the cutoff then, so I should have known the second time. But anyway, it's a really great perk. It doesn't cost you anything. Don't assume that you're enrolled automatically. You're not. You got to fill out that paperwork. And the paperwork is pretty helpful in giving you instructions of how exactly all of this works, but just keep this on your radar. As for getting around the city, I do have a Seattle private driver I trust and recommend. His name's Tulu. I'll drop that information below if you're interested. I love using a private driver because it is just much more fancy feeling. You've got someone there greeting you. It's a friendly face. You know it's going to be a good experience. And in many cases, hiring a private driver is not that much more expensive than an Uber or a Lyft. And if you have even more than 3 people in your party, sometimes it's cheaper than taking the cruise line transfer service, which in my experience, cruise line transfer service is pretty unpleasant. So with a private driver, it really makes sense if you have a group and you're hauling a lot of bags. If you're solo or a couple, ride share is typically going to be your best bet, or even a cruise line transfer. But again, I personally hate the inconvenience of a cruise line transfer, but I also love the opportunity that when you hire a private driver, you can also get a little city tour in. And Seattle is really, really cool. I've been there a few times for cruises and also just land vacations. And if you want to get around and see the sights and have someone to watch your bags in the car while you're going up the Space Needle, for example, or in my case, I've been there a million times, but I always like to stop at the first Starbucks and I like to shop in all the markets. Having a private driver is a really great opportunity for you to do that. Now, related to that, my biggest piece of advice, because Seattle is so cool and there is so much to do, is to fly in at least 1 day before the cruise. Now, that's standard good practice in cruise world because things happen in flights and you do not want to miss your Alaskan cruise. I know someone in real life last year who missed an Alaskan cruise with her family because of a flight delay issue, and it was very heartbreaking. It actually made the news. It was a whole story, a whole thing. But anyway, any cruise, you're gonna wanna fly in at least a day before, but definitely on an Alaskan cruise, especially because they do tend to be more expensive. So if you miss it, you're out a lot more money. But always get your travel insurance. I have a guide to travel insurance for cruisers, so check that out. But with Seattle, it's especially important because again, there's so much cool stuff to see and do. And that night lets you get around, see the city. And again, if you're like me, you got a big time difference between Eastern time and out on the West Coast. It gives you a little bit more time to adjust to that time difference and all of that jet lag. So take your time, see a little bit of the city. You'll have that buffer for a flight delay and make sure you get a hotel. But quick pro tip, I've learned the hard way in Seattle. Sometimes when I fly in the night before a cruise, I will just get a hotel near the airport because it's just convenient. But in Seattle, oddly enough, by their major airport, which is SeaTac, it's kind of like a desert. There's some hotels, but it's very industrial. So it's very difficult to walk to like shops and restaurants and things to do. It's basically the airport and some hotels and some industrial stuff. So if you do want to get around and even walk around and get a basic meal, getting a hotel near the airport in Seattle is usually not the best move. It's worth a little bit of extra money to get closer into the city so you can actually do some things, at least in my opinion. Another important thing to know about Alaskan cruises is that almost every round trip Seattle itinerary is going to include a stop in Canada. Usually it's Victoria, and there is a weird reason for that. It all comes down to a law called the Passenger Vessel Services Act, PVSA. Most major cruise lines are foreign flagged. That means they're not headquartered in the United States. And they do that, of course, so they can circumvent all of the pesky US laws like worker protections, but I digress. But anyway, that law restricts them from carrying passengers directly between 2 United States ports. So that Canadian stop is what allows them to kind of get around that rule, and it lets a typical Seattle round trip sailing stay on the right side of the law. So a lot of times when you do have that little required pit stop in Canada, it's usually a pretty short call, unfortunately, because Victoria is pretty awesome. I wish I had more time to explore. But on every one of my Alaskan cruises, my call to Victoria has been 4 hours. And it's usually been weird times. My first one was 8 p.m. to midnight. I still got out, I still walked around, and even if it is a short call, I still recommend getting off the ship because it's still, I think, worth it and it's still pretty cool. But just make sure you understand that that's probably gonna be the case, that you're gonna have a really short call. I also wanna clear up some passport confusion because this is something I see get asked a lot. A passport is always strongly recommended for any cruise, but it is not always required for a US citizen on a closed loop cruise. So a closed loop cruise that starts and ends in Seattle, many folks can sail still with a birth certificate and a government photo ID instead. So the exact rules depend on your citizenship, your age, and your specific itinerary. So always make sure you verify what your sailing requires. But I always do recommend bringing your passport every time. If you don't have one, just go ahead and get it. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to get my passport, which sounds weird because I travel all the time. But once I got it, I became a travel enthusiast and obsessed nut. But it's really not as hard as you think it is. Just go ahead and this is your sign, get your passport. But of course, always consult with your cruise line with that specific itinerary and make sure you have all the documentation that you need. There is also a kind of a weird quirk about Alaskan cruises that sometimes catches people off guard, even seasoned cruisers who cruise other destinations without any problem. Canada can refuse entry to someone who has certain criminal convictions, including an old DUI. So there are ways to deal with it ahead of time, but there are some intricacies to this and can take time and they are not guaranteed. So if this applies to you and you're dreaming of an Alaskan cruise, you might want to make sure that you can legally enter Canada and make sure that you are aware of this. Again, contact the cruise line, get all the specifics, but don't let it catch you unaware. As for Victoria itself, as I said, it's usually a pretty short call, unfortunately, because I love Victoria. So most cruise ships that home port out of Seattle are going to stop in Victoria. And the port at Ogden Point there is great because it's close enough to reach downtown on foot, by shuttle, or with a short taxi ride. Or what I did on my most recent visit, which was really fun, was a pedicab. I did it spontaneously. I didn't book anything in advance, especially because it is such a short port of call. I usually just figure I'll just get off and walk around and play it by ear. But I ended up hiring a pedicab. It was a really great way to get around and see the city. So check your arrival time before you spend money on a tour because you have a short period of time and a lot of attractions close early. So on every visit I've ever had to Victoria, unfortunately it's been at nighttime. So there are some attractions there I would love to visit that I have not been able to visit because they're never open when I'm there. So on those short evening calls, you can save some money, just walk the inner harbor, take a pedicab, again, take a taxi, rideshare, whatever. But on a longer daytime call, Victoria can actually justify a proper tour. Now let's talk about Ketchikan. It's one of the easiest ports to enjoy without spending a lot of money. In fact, I don't think here you really need an excursion, as long as, one caveat, your ship docks downtown. I've stepped off at berth 2 and reached Creek Street in under 5 minutes. It's great because downtown is compact, it's walkable, there's tons of really cute and quirky shops, historic buildings, waterfront views, lots of great Instagram photo ops, and pretty good places to eat. My cheap Ketchikan day is just strolling Creek Street, wandering through downtown and the Southeast Alaska Discovery Center. And that's pretty cheap. It runs about $2 to $5 for adults and it's free for kids under 15. So for $5, especially if you hit it on a day when it's rainy and very unpleasant and gray, you get a lot of exhibits, films, nature stuff, all that kind of stuff. And one of my favorite places to visit in Ketchikan is Dolly's. I'll let you look that one up yourself. The big exception in Ketchikan that does require some planning and awareness in advance is Ward Cove. This is a separate cruise terminal that sits several miles outside downtown. So you're a little out of luck if you're docking there because there's some disadvantages to docking there, namely that it's far away from everything. It is primarily used by Norwegian, but they do have a free shuttle. It does take about 20 minutes each way into and back from town. So if you do have a cruise that docks at Ward Cove, you want to make sure that you account for that, especially because a lot of Alaskan cruise port stops tend to be short in general, as we just discussed, Victoria being the prime example, but the other ones are generally pretty short as well. So if you have a short port of call and you're eating up 40 minutes just with round trip transportation, that's going to eat into your day quite a bit. So if your ship does dock at Ward Cove, make sure you do plan accordingly. It also is important to know about Ketchikan. It's one of the wettest stops on most Alaskan itineraries. So again, that waterproof layer, it's imperative, even if you get off the ship and it looks like a sunshiny day. Always bring a waterproof layer in Alaska. This port in particular does seem to have a way of proving the weather app wrong pretty consistently. Now let's talk about another port. Is it my favorite? Juneau it. I'm sorry, I'm so corny. I always do that when I make videos on TikTok and I'm always gonna keep doing it. I don't care if you like it or not. But Juneau is where I'm willing to open my wallet because compared to the other ports of call in Alaska, there's way more to do here. Most ships dock downtown or close to it, and the ones using the more distant AJ dock, they typically run transportation toward the main waterfront. Downtown itself is walkable, so hopefully you have a ship that docks right there. You can get off the ship, you can just walk around. There's lots of restaurants, museums, and shops that are really close together, and you also can walk easily to the Gold Belt Tram. That's the aerial tram that runs up Mount Roberts from the cruise dock. Unfortunately, they've had lots of issues. They've been plagued with incidents with high winds because it is Alaska after all, and the tram shaking, so it has had closures. So don't always count on this running, and make sure you do your research in advance before you're banking on that. But in my opinion, while Gold Belt tram is a great option, I personally wouldn't burn a whole day in Juneau just doing the Gold Belt tram because there's so many other things to do here. So what I do like to spend my day on in Juneau is the kind of experience that you simply cannot recreate on foot. There's whale watching, helicopter flight seeing, glacier landings, dog sledding. I've done dog sledding before, but heads up, it's not so much like romantic white snow, but it's more like sloppy mud. It's still a really great time, highly recommend, but it's dirty. But on my most recent Alaskan cruise, on my stop in Juneau, I went whale watching and it was absolutely fantastic. I've been whale watching other places before, like in California and in Cabo, but let me tell you, whale watching in Alaska, it just hits different. If you take an Alaskan cruise, you gotta get at least one whale watching excursion in. And yes, you will see whales from the cruise ship, but a whale watching experience or excursion gets you up much more close and personal. And you have guides there to walk you through fun facts, migration and feeding behavior. I'm a nerd. I love learning this stuff, so I was eating it up. And again, about that dog sledding tour, absolutely beautiful, but it's going to be really muddy. So there's a lot to do in Juneau, and if you're going to burn money on an excursion, this is a good one because there's a lot of great options. Now, if you don't want to spend a lot of money, because again, excursions, Alaska, very expensive. A must-see destination in Juneau is Mendenhall Glacier. And this does take a little bit of planning. The visitor center is about 13 miles from downtown, and here's an important thing to understand. Admission to the glacier area itself is cheap. It's like $5, and you can actually buy your admission at machines in the parking lot or inside the center. The big expense though is getting out there. So what a lot of people do, what I did on my first Alaskan cruise, is I just went and took a taxi. And what happened, and I found out later, I got a little bit hoodwinked. The driver talked me into buying an admission ticket from him. Now it was a legitimate admission ticket. It got me in, but basically what they do is they mark it up and they sell it to you, kind of leading you to believe that you have to buy it from them. So don't get swindled by a driver. And it's also tricky because getting there via taxi is easy, but getting back is not necessarily so easy. Now there will be taxis out and about, but cell phone service there is very spotty, and there's not like a big line of taxis always waiting to return people back. And if you think I'm going to take the public bus because that's a nice ball at a budget option, make sure you're ready to walk because it will drop you about 1.5 miles away. Even if you're willing to do the walk, it's going to kill you in time because again, these calls at these Alaskan ports are pretty darn short. So for most cruisers, reserving a shuttle in advance or taking a taxi or doing an excursion is typically the practical choice. And they can sell out on busy days, so this is one that you want to plan for. But Mendenhall Glacier itself, absolutely amazing, wonderful, beautiful. It's not an arduous hike at all to get there, so even folks with mobility limitations in most cases traverse there without too much difficulty, and definitely worth a visit. And a lot of excursions will do combo visits. They'll visit Mendenhall Glacier, then they'll take you whale watching. So as you know, if you follow me, I'm not a big fan of cruise line excursions. I usually tell people to go on their own and go independent. But with Juneau, if you're gonna do something like this is one of the rare cases. I strongly recommend just book the cruise line excursion. And yes, if you're docking in Juneau and you love seafood, you gotta stop at Tracy's King Crab Shack. Heads up, it is expensive. And sticker shock, everything in Alaska is expensive. But if you love crab, it's usually worth every penny. I'm not a seafood person, so that's what people tell me, and I'm gonna believe them. Now let's talk about Skagway, where you get 2 good days in one. Skagway hands you a great free day and a great paid day, and you can do a little bit of both. Skagway is a tiny town, somewhere around 1,100 year-round residents, and it has a historic core sitting there right by the water. The wooden storefronts and raised boardwalk give that whole gold rush vibe still, though some of those streets fill up really fast when you've got more than one ship there at the same time. Here's a quick docking quirk worth knowing. Skagway has 3 main deep water docks, the Railroad, Broadway, and Ore docks. And the Railroad dock alone has forward and aft spots, so you may see a few different berth codes on the schedule. Assignments can shift for all types of operational reasons, and depending on your cruise line and your ship's berth and conditions, your day may involve a shuttle, a short transfer, or even, unfortunately, a tender. So with this one, sometimes it's hard to predict if you're gonna be able to just get off the ship and be right there. On my most recent visit, I luckily had the good spot where we docked at the pier and waltzed right into town in like minutes. Now you can check the official cruise calendar for your date if you already have an Alaskan cruise booked, and you can typically try to figure this out in advance. But either way, you're on a cruise, you're in Alaska, you're gonna have a great time no matter what. But if you get that Broadway dock, which I got, that's the good one. For a free day, you can start at the visitor center, walk the historic district, dip into some of the small museums, and make your way toward Pullen Creek. The Gold Rush Cemetery is another option if you don't mind a little bit of a longer walk. And for a paid day, my pick for you in terms of spending your money here and getting its worth is the White Pass and Yukon Route Railway. It's a narrow gauge line that climbs up into the mountains along the original Klondike route. Now, there are a couple of different options here. There's usually a shorter summit run and a longer run. I chose the shorter summit run, and I'm very glad that I did because I absolutely loved it. I found it to be worth every penny. The scenery is out of this world, and I loved hearing about the history and enjoying the train ride. But I wanted to see other things in town, which I had time to do. And also, full disclosure, I got a little touch of the ADHD and I get bored pretty easily. And being on that train for longer than that short summit ride probably would have made me excruciatingly bored. So if you get bored easily or you have small kids, my recommendation is to go with that shorter summit run that takes you up. You see all the beautiful things, you get to come back down, and you still have time to spend in town. When it comes to Skagway, it is beautiful, but it is tiny. And because of that, Skagway's restaurants, they fill very quickly. They're very crowded. So eat early or wait it out until the first lunch rush is over. And brace yourself again for those prices. I keep hitting this because it's a sticker shock. Everything in Alaska is expensive, which makes sense because it has to be hauled in, especially here, which is a remote seasonal town. Now let's talk about Sitka. Sitka feels different than the other big ports, and in the best way. It's very Russian. It's Russian colonial past and the Tlingit heritage that's visible all over town, from St. Michael's Cathedral to Castle Hill to the totem poles that you'll see pretty much everywhere. In Sitka, it makes for a day with a lot more history and less shopping. Shopping's more kind of the Ketchikan thing. Sitka is more about history and culture, and I like both, so I'm here for it all. Most large ships use Sitka Sound Cruise Terminal, which is a few miles from downtown, and there's a free shuttle that runs about 10 to 15 minutes each way. They've started asking guests to reserve a shuttle time, so make sure you sort that out when you get on the ship. And again, you got to pay attention, especially on an Alaskan cruise. As I mentioned, I miss the Port Valet luggage option because I get so many papers on a cruise, I don't read it half the time. With Alaska, you really got to be on the ball. Some ships tender closer to downtown instead, so you can check your ship's arrangement and itinerary. Now, don't count on an instant ride share here. Ride share is not a thing in most of Alaska. So you can do a shuttle, a prearranged tour, your own feet, or a local taxi. Sitka National Historic Park is one of my favorite places in all of Alaska. It sits about half a mile from downtown, and its Totem Trail is a pretty easy 1-mile loop through the rainforest, and it's lined with Tlingit and Haida poles and passing the ground tied to the Battle of Sitka in 1804. So there's a lot of history and culture here. And even if you're not into that kind of stuff, what I love about it, it's super, super peaceful. Alaskan cruises are great, but it can be frenetic because, again, you're talking really tiny towns, lots of cruise people. And at the park, you get to actually vibe out, like really enjoy the beauty. And this is a kind of day where if you get kind of that gray, drizzly mist that's very prevalent in Alaska, it actually adds to the vibe rather than taking away from it. So this is another opportunity where you can save money on those really expensive Alaskan excursions and just get yourself there. It's not very far from the terminal, and it's really a cheap and beautiful experience. Now, if you're into wildlife watching, fishing, or a more remote boat trip, an excursion or formal tour can definitely be worth it. But if you like history and walking and just soaking in the vibes, this is a great day where you don't really have to spend money. Now let's talk about rooms on an Alaskan cruise, staterooms. Here's the upgrade I promised you at the start, and it's the most important money decision on the whole trip. On an Alaskan cruise, the scenery is part of the experience. Some of the best moments happen while the ship is actively moving, sliding through the inside passage, easing up to a glacier, passing just more waterfalls than you can count, and obviously the mountains. So your cabin choice here really does matter, much more so than a lot of other cruises. Because don't get me wrong, I actually don't even mind interior rooms. I like the dark. I can sleep really well. They tend to be a little bit quieter often. And so I don't even mind interior rooms. But for a lot of folks, an Alaskan cruise is a once-in-a-lifetime bucket list, and the scenery really makes it worth it to get that balcony. And on my most recent Alaskan cruise, I had an obstructed balcony, and even with a big old orange lifeboat blocking a lot of the view, it still was worth it. So I saved a lot of money having that obstructed view, and I still got to enjoy all of the beauty in Alaska. So there are still ways to save while still getting that view. And of course, an ocean view is also a great option too. Now, of course, you can't go out and enjoy the crisp Alaskan air and whale watch as easily as you can with a balcony room, but I think better than an interior. So if you've got the money to spend, this is where I would actually allow for room in the budget to upgrade. So when it comes to Alaska, make sure you pack right, layers, hoods, waterproof jackets. That's really all you gotta know when it comes to packing. Don't overcomplicate it. You also have to prepare for small towns with a lot of people. You also have to prepare for a lot of adjusting. Daylight when your body feels like it's gonna be night, make sure you pack your eye mask and account for that. But if you get a chance to take an Alaskan cruise, my recommendation, absolutely take it. They are expensive, but again, bucket list thing, worth every penny. Let me know your Alaskan cruise experience and your top recommendations down in the comments below, and let's talk ship.